Hi, and welcome to the last lesson of the series How to Create in 72 Hours a Serious Game That Hits the Mark. The topic of this lesson is Lock is Completed. In this lesson, I'll talk about the sound creation, a very underrated argument highly important to create a game that communicates strong experiences. The second subject is how we created the logo and the name of the game. The third is what kind of marketing strategy we used. It's very rare to see game jam projects with cool audio. The developers very often create the audio in the last 40 minutes, taking placeholder sounds from the internet, and the game experience is completely ruined. I remember a lot of games with cool mechanics but with terrible sounds that made me laugh because they broke the entire experience. Now I leave the slides to my colleague Nicolas, the sound designer who created all the sounds of Locked.
Hello everyone, welcome. I am Nicolas Mihog, the audio guy, and you'll have to bear me for some minutes. I'm quite sorry for you. In this lesson, I will talk about the methods we use for the audio in order to have a clear enough vision for the entire team and going in the same direction, have a coherent sound that supports the overall experience, and finally for the composing, the thought processes and sound selection. Generally speaking, I will talk more about the making process and some characteristics you might want to consider for your works, rather than the tools used, since you can use any, really, and the instruments, since that is mostly up to your artistic vision. Before starting, I will give some basics of the audio context. In most movies, cartoons and video games, audio is very easily around 50% of the product in terms of delivery, since audio hits the emotional side of the brain. So it is very important to touch the right buttons that visuals cannot, since they require a bit more of logic. And you want to not only fully support what people see, but to enhance it. That is part of this job. The first thing we did was defining a mood and an ambience. Right after this, also the pacing, the context, and some visual references for the ambience. As you can see, the ambience was ethereal, clean, futuristic, and almost godly, like in movies. We decided that the mood had to be calming with a bit of anxiety, since it involved difficult decisions, but they were in a futuristic ambient, almost as if you could save someone with clicking on one of these transparent screens. And so everything else came by itself, like pacing, which was clearly slow, soft, with some bits that enhance the decision making by changing slightly the pacing perception, which I'll explain later in the video. Now let's get into the making. The first thing I worked on was the background soundtrack, which will be the foundation for everything else. This is how it sounds. This is pretty much it. Everything mixed together, mood, ambience, calm, but a bit of anxiety underneath. The first thing of this part that I focused on were the most important ones. How to give a bit of anxiety and feeling of important decision making. To give that, I started very simple. Since anxiety is a constant feeling, what I did was making a constant note. What very easily creates anxiety is a bass, but also a repetitive pattern, as if it's a breathing song. So my sound selection process made me get to the conclusion that a breathing bass would work. And what I enhanced was also the distortion to make it a bit more talkative. This is how it sounds. I also added some variation of pitch to make it unpredictable and even more anxious. Right after, I had to define what decision making sounds like. A thing everyone does while thinking before taking a decision is seeing all the possibilities and jumping around them, quite often at the same speeds. Having this in mind made me think it's basically a pattern you can reproduce with an arpeggio. Sound selection for me here was influenced by some movies where the thinking person sees all those numbers in the air, and these sounds are plucky and a bit dreamy. This is how it sounds like. Right after, since the anxiety and the decision making have been made, I wanted to give the ambience, so the ethereal futuristic feeling. For that I made some optimistic sounding chord progressions with a dreamy pad instrument. You could think of this section as if it's a background music for a spa. Relax your muscles. Think of a light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, around. Enough messing around. But to support the anxious side of these sounds, I added a layer on top of the chords that sometimes adds the sudden change that throws you off the feeling. And this is how they both sound together. As the last thing, I added a tiny melody to give it some direction and make it more solid as a soundtrack. My idea was to make it as if it's a wandering detective, because after all, both the detective and the person playing have to analyze the situation. For the instrument, again, I made a pluck that was a bit more smooth, so less annoying because it will be the main theme, so in front of your face, and added some effects to make it more spacey and dreamy, with reverb that gives space and grain delay that in this case adds different pitch harmonies that repeat over time, and volume alterations by cropping a bit of the main pluck. This is everything about the soundtrack section. Now that the foundation is there, you can work on the sound design for the gameplay and the menu. For the sound design, I wanted to make 3 sounds total, and I was also kind of forced to make few because of the little time we had. The sounds are the click of buttons, the card hover, and the card swipe. Since I won't go too much into the technicalities, but into the thought processes, what you will learn here will be how to make a sound in terms of structure, sound selection, and defining the purposes of each sound to achieve the desired goal. For the click sound of the buttons, I wanted to make the sound in the way I imagine a futuristic screen would sound like. Plucky, satisfying, and a bit glitchy. So I did the quickest thing to do. Sample selection of my own sounds. I actually advise you to mess around every now and then to make cool sounds of any kind, to have your own library. You never know, you might use some of them. In this case, I had this sound that was pretty much a mix of 2 sounds made with the synthesizer, a deeper pluck followed by a glitchy pluck with some added reverb for the space filling that you will also hear for the other sounds I made. For the swipe, the first thing that came to my mind was paper cards. When you shuffle them, they make indeed a paper sound, so I searched for some paper sounds and adapted them by pitch, by length, and so I made them more coherent with the game. To make it sound like a swipe, I added a swoosh sound right before it. This is how both sound together. To give it the initial touch on the swipe, I added a glitchy vibrating sound. And this is how it sounds all together. The magic of the swipe wasn't there yet, but I got lucky and I had some crystallish sounds I made some time ago. I used one for the higher pitch and one for the lower pitch. This is the high pitch. This is the low pitch. This is them together. And this is the entire sound all together. For the hover sound, all I did was take in one section of the swipe, in this case the magic crystal, and it already sounded great since the hover of the card and the swipe are two sections of the same action. The hover itself is less relevant than the swipe, so taking just a part of the more relevant sound, which is the swipe, should do the trick. So this will become the hover sound. This is everything I have done for the audio of the game. I hope it has been helpful and thank you for watching. Now let's get into the next section of the lesson.
The next subject is how we created the logo and the name of the game. We delayed this task during the jam because we had higher priority tasks before these ones, but at the last day we found some hours to decide the name and to create a cool animated logo. The creation of the logo was quick and short because we had very little time available. We brainstormed some ideas with a clear pillar in mind. It must be coherent with the coronavirus. So we searched online some coronavirus images, but all the ideas that came up in our mind required higher artistic skills, and we are not artists. So analyzing this constraint, we started to think about what artistic parts we are good at. And suddenly we thought about the animation and basic 2D art, because we created a lot of them for games and apps. So we wanted to create a simple logo but with an idle animation that makes it feel alive. This is our final result. We created a container that locks the coronavirus. For the name, we had two constraints: short and recognizable. The cool aspect of doing this type of task when the jam is almost finished is that in the previous days you most likely thought about the name subconsciously, so when you have to brainstorm you already have some proposals. We chose locked because it represents well the objective of the game, lock the coronavirus, and it's very short and recognizable. But again, probably it's not the best possible name for the game, but at least it's coherent and we are quite satisfied. The next subject is the marketing strategy that we applied after the game release. The first thing we made is to create a long list with all the media, YouTubers, streamers, Twitter accounts, and Facebook and Discord groups. So with everyone that came up in our minds. This is important because you could track the responses of the media, understanding if your approach is good or not. The second step is to plan a strategy. We decided to contact people with private messages and emails, so doing this way we tested the efficiency of our approach. Making A/B testing, for example, some messages were sent very shortly with only the link and little text. Other messages have been sent with more text telling about the jam and why we made the game. We delayed the post on groups because we wanted to have a hook to use to create the attention in the groups. The hook arrived very soon because multiplayer.it wrote almost immediately an article about us and the domino effect started. Also EveryEye, Tom's Hardware and other minor sites wrote about us in the afternoon. So with a lot of hooks we posted on the groups with the link of the big sites that wrote about us, so people were more attracted and played a lot the game. We arrived at the end of these lessons. It was a great pleasure for me telling you how we created our game, explaining all the tips and tricks that helped us a lot during the development. I hope these lessons gave you some knowledge. Thank you again for your time.